Hello and welcome to the Nexus. Today it's an all-Europe special. Protests in the UK, France and Germany, with fury being directed at the police. But is it the cops or the politicians they're really angry with? Also on the programme, Lost in Translation Part 2. We'll be talking to the Catalan translator dropped by Amanda Gorman's publishers because he's not black and he's not a woman. Well, violent protests aren't unheard of in Europe, but it is still a part of the world that prides itself on being relatively stable, where political disagreements are settled at the ballot box. Look across Europe and you can see people clashing with police pretty much all over the place. Whether it's in the UK, France or Germany, people are on the streets. It's not everyone by any means, but still enough to make the headlines. Sometimes it's frustration with lockdowns, sometimes it's about fighting new laws that give the state more power. What they all have in common is freedom. People don't want to give that up. But there's another common thread: troublemakers, hardcore, violent men and women who want to fight with the police. Okay, let's bring in our guest now, and we're joined by Fraser Myers, who is a journalist with Spiked Online here in London. Over in Paris, we have Alexis Poulain, a political commentator who runs his own media company. And finally, in Berlin, we have Ulrich Buchner, a professor of European Studies at Stanford University's Berlin campus. Welcome to all of you. Let's just start with something Amnesty International has said. The European governments have used the pandemic as a smokescreen for pursuing a pattern of silencing dissent. And they're talking about right across Europe. Fraser, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of that assertion?
I agree with it, actually. I don't think there's a kind of conspiracy to stop protest or stop dissent or stop opposition, but it has happened to have been convenient for governments to be able to say that, as they're telling people that they have to stay indoors, telling people that they can't gather in groups of more than certain people, and all these kinds of restrictions, those have also acted as a barrier to protest. And it's interesting in Britain in particular, where we now have the first indication that this sort of ban on protests is going to be continued well beyond the pandemic, because the government is introducing a new policing bill, which very, very obviously is inspired by some of the powers that police have acquired, during these kind of emergency period, and is seeking to make that permanent, essentially. So, yes, I'd agree with Amnesty International's statement.
OK, we're going to get into that bill a little later in the programme. Alexis, believe it or not, Amnesty International's first example following that sentence was all about France. Do you think that's a justifiable statement about France?
Yeah, totally. I mean, in France, we have a debate about a new bill on security, which is very dangerous for civil freedoms and liberties. So we are very aware of what's happening right now. And it's been 2 years of yellow vest protest where the state violence has been mounting and mounting to a degree where people have lost eyes, some members, and it's not acceptable in an old democracy like France. So clearly the atmosphere is not very good for democracy, even in France, and we have to be very aware of this. And I think Amnesty International is doing its job in saying, be careful, because if you start, you don't know where you're going to stop. And discussing it right now in the middle of a pandemic clearly is not the right time and the right moment.
Ulrich, is Germany the exception here, or do you feel the government has also tried to grab power for itself during the diversion, if you like, of the pandemic?
No, I clearly think we are the exceptions in this case. The German public reacted highly allergic in the times of terrorism, when there was a trend in the direction of security over freedom, and it didn't really lead to much. And right now we have a number of problems, but certainly not police violence or a centralization of law enforcement. This is not what we currently discuss, and I don't really see any movements in that direction.
That's an interesting point, Fraser. Do you think that the British people sort of sowed the seeds, if you like, by not pushing back hard enough against, say, anti-terrorism legislation?
Yes, and I think that what anti-terrorism legislation has in common with the situation right now is that governments were able to use fear, essentially, and fear often closes down debate, closes down discussion. It prevents you from having a kind of rational discussion about what our liberties should be. And certainly, I would say even more so in the pandemic, where actually many of the people who came out rightly against some of the new security laws in the wake of 9/11 in particular and 7/7 in the United Kingdom have been pretty silent. There's an entire human rights lobby that could almost not exist at the moment. They've raised a few questions about procedure and things like that, but haven't really challenged the state's assumption of power in the way that you might expect them to. So I don't blame the British people entirely. I think that we have to look at the way civil society has really failed to stand up for freedom as well. Perhaps the media too have failed in their duty to hold power to account and to question some of the severity of some of the laws and things like that. So yeah, I think that
if anything, I've noticed that the mainstream media tend to support the various lockdown measures, and if anything, they actually push the politicians for stricter measures.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, I remember a press conference a year ago, a week before the lockdown came in, and you had journalists hectoring the Prime Minister, asking, "When are you going to bring the police in? When are we going to start arresting people?" And it was pretty shocking. And I think that a lot of the pressure to lock down harder has come from the media. There's a great deal of kind of authoritarianism within the media. It's a very strange dynamic. It's not the way the media like to present themselves as these kind of great, tellers of truth to power. But I'm afraid that's how it's been.
Alexei, is that something that rings true for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to look at who owns the media. If it's, of course, billionaires, it's not their interest that there is social unrest and people stop working or want to overthrow capitalism. So clearly they will push for this. Independent media clearly are denouncing police violence and state violence. And even state media here have been talking about it months after it was the case, but they've still been addressing the issue. So I don't think here in France media are pushing for a strict authoritarianization of the crisis. Here we have a fight between the politician and the scientist. The scientists clearly want a lockdown, want to have very strict measures, and the politicians want the economy to thrive and don't want to have a lockdown like we used to have last year. So the fight is between those two groups, and the media are in between, trying to see where is the truth and where actually is the way forward. Well, of course, way forward is vaccination, but in France we are missing everything from doses, vaccine, and organization. And I think the French people have been very quiet during all this pandemic crisis compared to how they've been on the street against the reform of retirement, the reform of job employment, and things like that.
Why do you think that is, Alexei?
I think because there is fear for the thing, and there is the fact that French people don't want to spread the disease. I mean, they are very careful about the others, and they don't want to be the one being blamed for this. So they are obeying orders, even if they are stupid, to a point. And I think we just came to this point after a year of obeying and being very good law-abiding citizens. So it's time for disobey. Yeah,
I can see why then you would have sympathy for Amnesty International's assertion that governments are trying to purloin extra powers for themselves whilst they're able to hold this pandemic, the threat of the pandemic, over everyone's head. Fraser, we're going to deal with the bill that you mentioned now. It's called the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. Not exactly catchy. A lot of British people are aware of it distantly, but they don't quite know why everyone's so upset. Do you want to just take us through the most objectionable parts of the bill?
Yeah, and I do have to highlight the most objectionable parts because it's a mammoth bill. It's about, it's over 200 pages.
Yeah.
What people are objecting to most, and there are many protests about this, there have been protests in Bristol, protests in London, is the fact that it effectively gives the police and the Home Secretary, the power to pretty much call off any protest. Any protest that carries the risk of essentially causing a nuisance, causing what they call, upset or distress or annoyance, can basically be shut down. which, as you know, any observant person will know, that's pretty much the point of protest, is to disrupt, to annoy, to irritate, to make noise. They even have rules against what single person protests. I mean, that's how extraordinary this legislation is. So, and it gives police power to change, you know, to give orders as to when protests can start and finish, what routes they can take, all kinds of things. So it's a really, really scary kind of circumscription of what used to be taken as a pretty foundational democratic right, the right to protest.
Ulrich, I noticed a wry smile when you were listening to Fraser's lists of powers that were going to be introduced in this bill. You must think this is ridiculous.
Well, it's not ridiculous because it's a very serious problem in both countries that have been presented here. But again, we are at a different spot in the discussion. The history of Germany is a history of a totalitarian country. Both Nazi Germany and in the GDR, people experienced what it means to fully centralize authorities and law enforcement. And the consequence is that we decentralize police powers. So the police is a responsibility of the regional level, like the Länder, and we do have something like an FBI, but it's by no means comparable with the FBI in the United States. So our discussion was, shouldn't we centralize a bit more to reduce the coordination costs? If Merkel and the governors meet to discuss what is the right approach if the numbers go up, then we cannot waste 16 hours of negotiations. In the end, they come up with a ridiculous idea what to do over Easter, and then Merkel apologizes and takes it back. This is by no means a restriction of protests or a different type of legislation.
Alexei, we've looked at the UK bill, which so many people find objectionable. Let's look at the French one, the Global Security Bill. It's a very grand name. I have to ask you about that. Just remind us why so many people are protesting against the bill.
Well, the bill is more about surveillance than security, and techno-surveillance as well. It's how the state can actually use any means, including the internet, your mobile phones and everything, to spy on you for your security, of course. Even drones, they were used without any legal frame back in 2020, and the Conseil d'État, which is the supreme authority about law and constitution, said you can't use anymore these drones for police reasons. We have to pass some new bills, and this bill is one of them. And the fear is that you could have drones filming inside your home without any protest from your side, any legal action to protect yourself from the state surveillance. And the state surveillance goes as far as getting into your social networks to see where you're traveling, what you're buying, what you're doing for tax purposes, for example. And it's going too far. I think, you know, the line between democracy and totalitarianism regime is the fact that you don't have privacy anymore. Yeah. And pushing privacy to its final boundaries is clearly being in an authoritarian movement that is not good for democracy.
A particularly contentious part of the bill was Article 24, which made it a criminal offence, or would have made it a criminal offence, to publish images of on-duty police officers with the intent to harm their physical or psychological integrity. I was going to ask if these protests make any difference. As far as I understand, this aspect of the bill has been dropped?
Yeah, it's been dropped because the issue with this Article 24 was that as a journalist, you would have been a criminal filming police doing their job. So you couldn't do your job as a journalist. And that was where it stopped, because then the French Minister of Justice says, oh, well, wait, we can change the law about freedom of the press. And then it was, stop, let's stop, let's move on and then change this bill, which is clearly not a good thing for our country. And they moved on, and no, of course, it's a smaller offense of filming and decrypting a policeman and giving his address or personal name and identity and social network, which is very different from doing your job of a journalist during protests.
I know all of you will no doubt say something that is sort of a truism. Protests are how the public makes their voice heard. But let me bring in something a little contentious here. If you were to get even 100,000 people on the streets of most of these major European countries, that would account for around 0.1% of the population. And I do wonder if these protesters really, I mean, of course, there are many types of protests and many reasons for protesting, but I do wonder if there is actually, if they're representative of the people, or if there is a disconnect between them and the general population watching at home on the television who wouldn't dream of doing what they're doing. Fraser, if I could just start with you. Are these protests we've been seeing over the last year or so a demonstration of democracy, or actually a subversion of it, or an attempted subversion of it?
Well, in a democracy, even minority views are allowed to be heard and are supposed to be heard and should be a part of the debate. So I don't see it as a challenge to democracy in any particular way. I mean, if we are talking about certainly the anti-lockdown protests that have taken place over the past year don't represent public opinion. The public are, by and large, very on side with the measures being taken to contain the virus. Even if you're talking about Extinction Rebellion, which seemed to be one of the targets of the police bill, you know, many people find them annoying, and certainly they have quite an extreme view about the environment that isn't shared about the public. But that shouldn't matter. They should have a right to express their view in a democracy, and people can make up their own minds as to how they feel about an issue. And we should use protests to bring attention to
about
issues.
the risk, Fraser, of the media. The media needs to feed the 24-hour news machine. They put the cameras on this tiny number of people, and then they say, you know, this is a reflection of what people want. And sometimes the protesters get it wrong, don't they? Well, I'll give you an example. There was a vigil after the murder of Sarah Everard. The police were told to control it, to break it up because of the coronavirus restrictions. And then politicians immediately jumped on the police and said, Cressida Dick, the head of the Metropolitan Police, a woman who's worked all her life to get to that position, ought to resign. Then we have this independent watchdog that comes out with a report and says, actually, all those armchair generals over the weekend making calls and judgments on the operational integrity from their armchairs, they got it wrong. In fact, the police responded in a proportionate way and in a respectful way, despite being abused to their faces. So, I mean, you can tell me what you think of that, but you can also tell me if you think that sometimes the protests that followed that said, defund the police are brutal, sometimes they get it wrong.
Well, I think that it has to be said that the politicians are total hypocrites in that instance, because the police were enforcing laws that they put in place. So you can't, and then suddenly they were having a go at the police for breaking up this event that they had made illegal. So I can totally understand the point about armchair generals. I wouldn't agree that the police watchdogs are always right. Often, there is a sense that they look after their own a little bit. So I think it would be naive to take their word for it all.
Sure.
But I understand what you mean. I mean, the thing is, we should be able to see the protests as a kind of launch pad for a debate. We don't have to take the protesters' word for any issue, and we don't have to take their opponent's word for any issue. Let's use protests as a starting point for discussion and debate, and that's what democracy is about.
Ulrike, a final question for you. I want to talk about the frustrations to do with the lockdown, but also to do with the vaccine rollout in Germany. Everyone always assumes that Germany is very efficient, fantastic manufacturers there, and unfortunately, Germany, along with France and the others, are lagging well behind with the United Kingdom. To what extent has that fueled the frustration and anger and indeed protests around Germany?
Well, this is what I meant by we have a number of problems that need to be addressed. And the support rates for the German government right now is drastically sinking, while in the first year, Merkel reached a record high in the way she handled it, not as the commander-in-chief, but as basically a scientist. She's a natural scientist by education who tries to share the trial and error method of the people that she was listening to. Right now, the situation is different, and there is more anger and more frustration, but we should also not mix up the situation in Germany when it comes to numbers or how harsh the measures have been here. It is much, much milder, and we have been very lucky. So the level of frustration and also how much money has been spent to help people who are in economic and social problems, that the situation here is still much better than in a number of countries that we can compare with.
Ulrich Bruckner and Alexis Poulain and Fraser Myers, thank you all so much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Let's turn to our second story now. And you'll remember a couple of weeks ago we covered how European translators were dropped by Amanda Gorman's publishers because they weren't black women like herself. Well, not at the behest of Amanda Gorman, who actually had a hand in picking them, but because of a campaign led by so-called cultural activists on social media. Well, the 17 very accomplished translators include Marieke Lucas-Renfeld from the Netherlands, Nuria Barrios from Spain, and our guest today, Victor Obioz. Mr. Obioz, thanks so much for being on the Nexus today. Let me ask you, how were you informed that you were no longer wanted for that translation?
Well, once I had already delivered my translation, I had a phone call from my publisher saying that according to the, I don't know who, the agent or the publishing house from Amanda Gorman, I was not suitable for being the translator of this work.
For what reason? I mean, you've been translating for 30 years. Is this the first time that someone's looked at your profile and said, you know, you can't do the translation because you're not X, Y, or Z?
Yes, that's right. But in fact, I was thrilled to do it because I had watched the inauguration of the president, and I saw this girl, this poet, performing, and I thought it was like a poetess. It was wonderful, no? After all this nightmare that was these 4 years in the States, that was a good sign. So I was so happy to contribute to this new age, this new epoch. But unfortunately, well, that's what happened. And I might say that I understand. I understand what happened. You know, it's a part of this what they call affirmative action, and positive discrimination is something that in the States is very common. But it never happened before in the world of translation.
But to say that you need to be exactly that person in order to translate them well, well, I mean, you said yourself, I mean, you were quoted in many newspapers, if I cannot translate a poet because she is a woman, young, black, and an American of the 21st century, then I cannot translate Homer either because I am not an 8th century BC Greek. Nor could I have translated Shakespeare because I'm not a 16th century Englishman. What's the point you're trying to make there?
Yeah, well, that, you know, that's what the translators they are scandalized because precisely translation is about building bridges between people and cultures. But I think we are mixing here two issues: what translation is about, and the problem of a political problem that is very these days I think it's hurting very much, especially America. So we must understand what is going on.
Sure, but
we cannot polarize the arguments.
Victor, you do understand that this wasn't at the behest of Amanda Gorman necessarily, but because of the stirring up over in the Netherlands by a cultural activist online. Do you think that she and various other people on her side have the right to kind of put this pressure on the publisher, which ends up depriving you of a job?
Yes, in some way, that's what I think.
So a cultural activist with 2,000 followers has the right to change the outcome of Amanda Gorman and her publisher to choose you. You think that this pressure from social media is acceptable?
Well, whether it's acceptable or not, that's a fact. So we have to. I think we need to make a very deep reflection on all that phenomenon, no? Or what happened. It's something that it's above, of course, my personal case. It's not important. What is important is what is the meaning behind all that.
Final question. I know that you're a big admirer of Amanda Gorman, and you said you'd like to meet her. You've even written a song or some sort of poem in her honor.
Yes, I did. It's a song of fraternity, of conciliation, of human understanding. Is about harmony. It's about subjects that are in her poem, in fact, and also I use a metaphor. I invented a metaphor for it. I said, Amanda, I'm not an island. I'm an isthmus.
Stick out.
I try to join continents.
Yeah.
Not isolate.
Well, Victor Obioz, thank you so much for joining us today on The Nexus. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones too for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, just go to our channel on YouTube, type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.